それではこれから平成25年度大阪市立大学国際学術シンポジウムの第1セッションですね、クリエイティブマネジメントのセッションを始めたいと思います。最初に前にご案内がありました通り、今日のこのセッションでは会場内に拡声器の音声が流れません。私はマイクを使用していますが、これは同時通訳の方に聞いていただくためのマイクロフォンです。で、皆さんは前に出てます通り、お手元の机の上にありますレシーバーの1チャンネル、2チャンネル、それぞれに日本語と英語の放送音声が同時通訳の方から流れてきますので、そちらを聞いていただくことになりますので、よろしくお願いいたします。で、最初今日の報告はですね、皆さんのお手元の小録集のおそらく7ページぐらいからだと思いますけれども、流れが書いてあります。で、私は今日全体の司会をさせていただきます経営学研究家の川村と申します。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。で、これから私の方からですね、今日の最初にその登壇者とそれからセッションの趣旨をご説明した後、今日のワークショップを指導していただくスティーブ・テイラー先生に壇上に上がっていただいて、こちらに集まっていただいた参加者の方々と同時に皆さん会場に集まっていただいた方々にも一部分のエクササイズは参加していただきたいと思いますので、ぜひ積極的に参加していただければと思います。で、まずこのセッションの趣旨をご説明します。この第1セッションは大阪市立大学商学部経営学研究科が提供するものです。で、経営学研究科では2009年度からですね、今前にご紹介してます通り、医療職、福祉職向けに経営教育を行う社会人プロジェクト研究というものを毎年開講しておりまして、今年で今前に出てます通り、2014年度で第6期目の募集を今しているところです。で、この教育プログラムの中で特に医療職、福祉職ではさまざまな現場において、それぞれの専門を超えたコラボレーション、協力してさまざまな複雑な問題に立ち向かっていくことが要請されていることから、通常の講義とか演習という形式ではなくて、ワークショップという新しい学習の技法を使ってですね、その協力、それからその協力関係の中でのリーダーシップの発揮の仕方とかを学んでいただいています。それを一旦今日は市民の皆さんに公開するという趣旨で、この第1セッションでワークショップをやっていきたいと思います。で、今回は参加者として、通常は経営学研究科の社会人プロジェクト研究の医療職、福祉職の方々に参加していただきますが、今日はその中から4名、そしてあと経営学研究科で研究者を希望しておられる、方々と、それから今回の国際シンポジウムのためにですね、理系の研究家の皆さんからボランティアを募りまして、合計14名の受講者の方で、このステージ上でテイラー先生のワークショップを行っていただくことにしています。これから1人ずつ、登壇者をご紹介していきますので、お名前を呼びましたら登壇者の皆さんお手数ですがちょっと起立をして会場に向かって一礼をお願いできればと思います。まず、1人目は、医学研究科講師の山口悦子先生です。医療安全学ご専門です。それからお二人目、伊藤昭隆先生、理学研究科助教です。ご専門は物理科学です。3番目が西川圭介先生、理学研究科助教、有機合成科学ご専門です。4番目がですね、早川義明さん、NTT ファシリティーズにお勤めで工学研究科の特任講師を務めていただいています。ご専門都市工学です。それから5番目が高井俊和さん、工学研究科後期博士課程です。今構造工学ご専門です。そして6番目が生活科学研究科前期博士課程で栄養学ご専門の四方幸奈さんです。そして、以上が理系の各研究科からご参加いただいた皆さんですけれども、これから4名の方は経営学研究科の社会人プロジェクト研究で学んでいただいている方々です。まず最初に近畿大学医学部講師西郷和正さん、 ご専門は神経内科です。それから井上明人さん、社会医療法人愛人会高槻病院明石医療センターで麻酔科をしておられます。それから次に社会医療法人成長会ベルランド総合病院の看護師看護部副部長をされております前原陽子さんです。そして、兵庫医科大学病院で臨床工学技師主任技師をされておられます木村正義さんです。そして最後に経営学研究科の大学院生の皆さんです。経営学研究科後期博士課程井上真帆さん、経営学研究科前期博士課程張伊順さん、経営学研究科前期博士課程辺見香奈子さん、そして経営学研究科前期博士課程原浩二さん、はい、以上の14年の皆さんにこれから壇上に最初にテイラー先生のレクチャーが終わった後ですね、壇上に上がっていただいてワークショップをしていただきますのでどうぞよろしくお願いいたします。そうしましたらここでマイクをテイラー先生にお渡しをしたいと思います。テイラー先生のご紹介は皆さんのお手元の小録に書いてあると思いますので。Could you please introduce Leslie?
Sure, thank you. And let me also introduce Leslie Stager, who will be joining us later via Skype from Cleveland. She's an actress and an academic, and now an organizational development consultant at the Cleveland Clinic. Hi, Leslie. Good. How are things in Cleveland? Not so chilly here. Okay, we'll have you back shortly, in maybe 1 hour, and we'll hear from you then. Thank you. Now we go to... I have the... Do you need this? All right, thank you. And good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, a real honor to be asked to come over. And today I'd like to talk a bit about leadership, and in particular about one aspect of leadership. I'd like to talk about connection and collaboration. Before I do that, let me start by saying, well, I'm just going to level with you. It's kind of the dirty little secret of leadership research, and that's that we don't know very much about leadership. It's been a subject of research for roughly 100 years in lots of different fields. And even after 100 years of study, we don't really know what leadership is. We can't agree on how to define it. Although at the same time, all of us in the leadership field do try and define it. This is how I define it. And essentially I say, I think of leadership as being a force that moves organizations. Just as Newton's laws of motion tell us that an object at rest tends to stay at rest, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless a force is applied to that object, I think that an organization at rest tends to stay at rest, and an organization in motion tends to stay in motion unless leadership is applied to that organization. This rather amorphous idea of leadership as a force is broad enough to include leaders, followers, and the spaces in between. And what you can see is rather than really try to define leadership, I've just ripped off physics. I've just stolen an idea from physics, from Newton, because he was a genius, and said leadership is really that thing that creates change in organizations. So it's not a simple thing. Leadership isn't simply what leaders do. It isn't. It's this much broader concept that includes leaders and followers, and includes that relational space in between and how connection happens between them. I'd also like to bring up my friend and colleague in Australia, Amanda Sinclair. When she talks about leadership, she's very clear about what leadership is about. Leadership is not simply an act of trying to influence other people or trying to get them to move in a particular direction. She says leadership should be aimed at helping to free people from oppressive structures, practices, and habits encountered in societies and institutions, as well as within the shady recesses of ourselves. Good leaders liberate. So here there's a very strong normative statement about what leadership is for. The leadership is not about trying to accomplish whatever the ends of the organization might be. It's not simply about trying to make more money or build a better car. Leadership is about liberation, about helping us to become more. And I want to keep that in mind because for me, that's an essential aspect of why we care about leadership. It's how we can all become more, become the best parts of ourselves. So if this is what leadership is, it says to me that leadership is fundamentally a creative process. And in many ways, this has long been recognized, that leadership is a creative process. The great leadership scholar James McGregor Burns once said that, talks about leadership, and he says, in every sense, it's a creative act. Leadership is always about creativity. Essentially, if you're just trying to keep on doing what you're doing without any change, without any creativity required, then really that's probably just management, and it's not real leadership. But this begs a question. If leadership is fundamentally a creative act, what do we mean by creativity? And I thought a lot about creativity, and I realized that in the West, and I'm going to, as an American, I'm certainly speaking very much from a Western perspective, and it's a perspective that I recognize as being culturally bound and perhaps not as applicable in Japan, but in some ways that's certainly influential here in the way that Western management becomes influential everywhere in the world these days. When we think about creativity in the West and in business organizations in particular, we think about a model of creativity that to me is really captured in the idea of the myth of the romantic genius. And that the person who really exemplifies that for me is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. This is a picture of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. You may not know Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was a poet in the middle 1700s, a famous romantic poet who wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And he wrote this poem, Kubla Khan, which is one of my favorites. It's a favorite poem not just because in English it's beautiful, and this is a case where I don't think it's important to translate this, but simply to listen to the language, the rhythm. It says, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. The language just flows along. The images are beautiful. The rhythm of the language is gorgeous. It's a very wonderful poem. And yet, when we look at the poem, it goes on a little bit longer than you see on the screen, but not much. Because this poem is an unfinished poem. It's a fragment of a poem. And when Coleridge published Kubla Khan, he also published an introduction to the poem. And the introduction to the poem is longer than the poem itself. And in the introduction to the poem, he tells the story of how he came to write it. And he says, I'm going to paraphrase here, he says that he was not feeling very well. He was feeling a little sick, a little poorly. So he took, as you did in those days, he took some opium. So he smoked some opium to overcome the pain of not feeling well and fell asleep. He fell unconscious for a period of 3 hours. And during that time, he had this wonderful dream, this vision of Xanadu. And the poem came to him in a dream complete, the entire poem, the inspiration from the gods. And he woke up and he started to write it down. And he just started writing. And before he had written it all, there was a knock on the door. It was a man from a nearby town called Porlock. And the man from Porlock, he answered the door, and he started to speak to him. And as he spoke to the man from Coleridge, spoke to the man from Porlock, he says it took him roughly 40 minutes to get rid of the man from Porlock. It took him roughly 40 minutes to get rid of him so he could go back to writing down the rest of the poem. And by the time he had gotten rid of the man from Porlock, he had forgotten the rest of the poem. So that all that exists is this little fragment at the start. And this is really the image of the creative genius. Creativity is about a flash of inspiration, a bolt from the blue. But we know from the research that this story Coleridge tells is not what happened. We know this story is a lie. We know this story is straight, pure marketing. We know from the research that he worked on this poem for a period of over 2 years because they found drafts of the poem at various times, dated over a period of a couple of years. We know that there's various allusions that he talks about putting into it. We know that he wrote this poem, just like every poem, through the process of hard work and craft, that he continued to work on it and master it and massage it and edit it, again, over a period of 18 months to 2 years. We also know that Coleridge often didn't finish poems. He was good at starting them, not very good at finishing them. And so there we have the real creative process was just about hard work, about constantly getting at it, about writing, about coming back and editing, working more over a long period of time, versus the story he told, which is the story of the flash of inspiration. And in the West, in the business world, we tend to focus upon creativity as that flash of inspiration. We think it's all about the creative idea. If I could just find that next big idea, I'd be all set. And in terms of creativity, what that is, that's focusing on what the German philosopher Nietzsche would call Dionysian creativity. That is to say, it's creativity that the Greek god Dionysus or Bacchus, the god of revelry, the flash of inspiration. That's the sort of creativity. And Nietzsche would say that's one type of creativity. But there's also Apollonian creativity, which is creativity that's much more ordered and structured, and is about craft mastery. It's about devoting yourself to your craft until you're really good at it. And that's the sort of creativity that the business world in the West doesn't pay much attention to. But as an artist, it's the sort of creativity that I'm used to. And when I talk to artists, I spent, for the last decade, as I travel around the world, I often talk to artists, and I ask them this question. I say, people in business want to be more creative. You're an artist, you're creative. What advice could you give them? And they tell me, they all say the same thing. When I say, what advice could you give people in business about creativity? The artists all say, I don't know what you mean. That I don't know what you mean by creative. And I go, well, the people in business say they want more creative ideas. And the artists all say the same thing. They all say, more ideas? I have too many ideas. I need fewer ideas. I don't have enough time to work on all the ideas I have. And the real difference here is the people in business are thinking of creativity in terms of Dionysian creativity, in terms of the Coleridge flash of inspiration, whereas the artist thinks of creativity in terms of Apollonian creativity, in terms of the hard work and mastery. So there's lots of ideas, and I don't need more ideas. I simply need more time to work on the ideas I have. And that idea of creativity as being about Apollonian creativity, it's about hard work and mastery of your craft, the way artists think about creativity, is the basis for my book, Leadership Craft, Leadership Art, which is, again, the basis for part of what I want to talk about today. And really, when I talk in the book, I suggest that creativity for leadership can be thought of in terms of 5 things. The first is that creativity is a process. It's not about a flash of inspiration. It's not about a creative idea. It's about the process of hard work, a process about craft mastery, a process of continually getting better at what you do. The second is that there's actually a creative mindset, and that is there's a way of approaching the world that creative people have that is perhaps somewhat different than most of us are trained to. And I'm not going to talk about that at length, but essentially, to give you a little teaser where you can read more about it if you wish, is that it's about the ability to stay with your senses and engage in not knowing, what Keats would call negative capability. Thirdly, passion is important. You're more creative the more you care about something. So finding out what you care about, what you really are interested in, or conversely, coming to care deeply about whatever it is you're working on is critically important for creativity. Fourthly, it's about collaboration. And that is to say, creativity is never a lone act. It is not that solo act. It is not Coleridge smoking opium alone and having a bolt of inspiration and writing it down. Creative acts always involve working with other people, sometimes very directly, sometimes more indirectly. I mean, there's a form of collaboration that happens when I read someone else's work, when I go to an art museum and I see a piece of art and I'm inspired to write something about management or leadership. That's all collaboration of a form. And again, that's what we're going to focus today. And finally, the fifth element is domain knowledge. You need to have domain knowledge and mastery of your domain, whether that domain is physics or medicine or leadership or business, before you're going to be really creative in that domain. Again, of these 5, I'm going to focus on collaboration today, and we're going to spend the rest of the time, rather than listening to me talk, because my guess is nobody really wants to do that, certainly not me, we're going to focus on doing some exercises to discover, collaborate, to look at what collaboration is, how it feels, and what gets in the way of collaboration. So if I could ask the workshop participants to come up on stage, and if we could shut off the slides. And as the participants are coming up on stage here, the first couple exercises we're going to do, I'm going to ask you in the audience to do as well. And these exercises require you to be with someone else. They are done in pairs. So I need everybody in the audience to find someone, just the person sitting next to you, or the person sitting in front of you or behind you. Find someone else that you can do these exercises with. So just take a moment now and pair up. Find someone else to work with. And you guys are in pairs? You're happy to work with? Yes? Okay, so you may need to move around to find someone to work with here. And let me explain. The very first exercise is a very simple one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to engage in a conversation with your partner. And I'm going to let you talk for a couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. And you can talk about anything you want. If it's somebody you don't know, maybe you want to just get to know each other. If it's somebody you know, maybe you want to talk about sports or the weather or whatever it is, why you came here today, whatever you want to talk about, you can feel free to talk about. But there's one rule to this conversation. And that rule is that you have to disagree with everything your partner says. So whatever they say, you must disagree with it. Okay? So it's a very simple conversation. Talk with your partner about whatever you want, and disagree with them about everything. And as you do this, I want you to also pay attention to how it feels. To pay attention to what does it feel like collaboration? How does the conversation feel to you? So have a conversation and disagree with everything the other person says. Okay? I'll give you a couple minutes to do this. Go. Okay, if I could have your attention, if you could bring that conversation to a stop. If we could come to a stop. All right, and I'm going to ask you to, we're going to continue this conversation with what changed to the rules. So I want you to continue to have the same conversation, but now I want you to agree with everything your partner says. So I want you to continue to have the conversation, but you must agree with everything the other person says, regardless of whether you actually agree or not. You must agree. So whatever they say, if they say, well, the sky is green, you have to say, yes, the sky is green, and agree with that and work on it. So whatever the other person says, you must agree with it. Okay, so go ahead and have your conversation and agree. Okay, let's bring that conversation to a close. And let me explain what we just did. I don't understand what anybody was saying in the room, but what I did see was differences, real differences in how you were saying it, what we call the body language, and real differences in what seemed to be going on. And just watching it from here, it seemed to me when you were having the disagree conversation, there was some laughter, but it was more nervous laughter, unusual laughter. And I didn't see a lot of connection happening. But with the agreement conversation, I saw a lot more connection. It seemed like something was happening, something was building. And this is the fundamental idea behind theatrical improvisation. In theater, we call it saying yes and that is being willing to agree with what the other person has offered us and moving forward with it. And in terms of theater, the real the way we talk about the structure is one actor makes an offer. And that offer can be almost anything. You know, an actor might walk up in a scene and say that, and might say, you know, you're looking beautiful today. And that's an offer to assume that that person is beautiful. Or they might say, do you have any melons for sale? And if you said, do you have any melons for sale? That's an offer to say, you are someone who might potentially be selling melons. And then it's the job of the other actor to agree with that, to accept that offer and add to it. So if I said, do you have any melons for sale? The other actor might say, in a scene would say, yes, I have melons, but they're $100 a piece today because they're very rare melons. So they've taken the offer of having melons and then added to it that they're special, unusual melons, and so on. And then it would go back and forth. And the idea is that each person continues to add to the scene, add to the offers that are being made. And when we call this, again, saying yes and in real life, we do the same thing when we interact with other people and we collaborate. When someone speaks up in a meeting, we can respond to that by saying yes, and by agreeing with by taking their offer and moving it forward. However, we can also respond by saying no. And more typically, someone might say something, and rather than accept their offer, we say no to it. We say no, but, or no, and, or sometimes even yes, but. All ways that prevent us from accepting that offer and move us into that negative conversation space, that disconnecting space that stops collaboration. So we're going to do another version of this, a slightly more structured version. And I'm going to ask, let me explain it first. This one, I want you to actually engage in a conversation where you practice saying yes and. So the structure of the conversation is the first person will ask a question. Any question at all, a question that could be answered with either yes or no. The other person will answer that question, yes, and then build on it and go farther with it. And then they will ask a yes or no question. And that person will answer it with yes and build on it and answer a yes or no question. So a scene might go, first person might say, did you have eggs for breakfast? The response would, of course, would be, yes, and I also had bacon for breakfast. Did you have fish for breakfast? I'd say, yes, and I also had hot coffee. Do you take your coffee burning hot? I'd say, yes, and so on. And it could go on until you can say, yes, I take my coffee burning hot, and I like to drink it on Mars. Do you go to Mars for coffee? Of course, we know in reality they don't go to Mars because none of us go to Mars, but well, at least I don't. They could ask and then say, well, yes, I like to have my coffee on Mars too. Because the whole point is you have to say yes to whatever it is, regardless of how outlandish or ridiculous it is. Okay, I get the idea of the structure? So it's you ask a yes or no question, the other person says yes, and adds to it, and then asks a yes or no question back. And you say yes, and. Let's try doing that for a few minutes. Let's see how that feels. And you guys can try that again up here in your pairs. Okay? So have the yes and conversation. Okay, let's bring that to a close. And let me, I heard some laughter. It looked to me like this was not easy. And one of the things this does is it starts to make you realize what your initial response is. How hard was it for you to always say yes, particularly if it was something that the answer wasn't really yes. The answer was no. Or the answer certainly felt like a no. And this is one of those things you can go through your life. Next time you're in a meeting, just watch. Watch yourself and watch everybody else and see how often do you say yes to what's happened when somebody makes an offer. When somebody says something, how often do you say yes and how often do other people say yes and versus how often they say no and or how often they say no but. And watch where the conversation goes. Watch what happens to the collaboration. When people say yes, I'm guessing, how many of you, by a show of hands, had something interesting emerge from the conversation as you said yes? Did anybody have something fun or interesting? Maybe a little bit? Yeah, some things back here. It leads us to a place. And the idea is we're trying to get to this sort of collaboration where it's really a kind of a 2 + 2 = 5. A synergistic thing where we get to a collaboration where something is created that neither of us could have created alone. And the idea is that conversation, if we both keep saying yes and adding to it, it takes us someplace that we would not have gotten to on our own. Something that only emerges from the collaborative environment. When we did this exercise, it was very verbal, very cognitive. We also, but part of the focus of what we're doing today is that a lot of this, saying yes, saying no, working and agreement, is done in an embodied way, through the body, and how we actually physically behave with each other. So we're going to do another version. We're going to do the same exercise, the same yes and, without words. And since we don't really have enough space for everyone to do it, you guys in the audience can just watch this one. I'm sure you're happy about that. And up on stage, we'll do this. Can we have you guys want to come forward? We're going to do this is called the handshake exercise. And essentially, the way it starts is if you two would start, they shake hands. They shake hands. One of them freezes. You freeze. You unfreeze. You can move. And now you get to add. You see that situation. You get to say yes to it and add to it physically. So you get to physically add to the image there. So you go see. So it's no longer a handshake. Now he freezes, and you come and add to it. Okay? Okay, and we can keep doing this for a while, but we're going to stop with you guys. And what we're going to do, just to make this kind of interesting, I want all these pairs kind of spread out, find some space on stage for each pair. Each pair is going to do this at the same time. They're all going to do this, so you can watch 7 different stories, 7 different physical yes ands emerge all at the same time. Okay, so if you want to spread out a little and find some space on stage, and go ahead. Okay, let's stop right there. That was wonderful. Thank you. You guys want to come back to kind of a... And so you could see some really interesting creative stuff was happening there. That something was emerging because they were physically saying yes and physically collaborating. And certainly things happened that neither one of them would have expected. And certainly neither one would have gone on their own. And so this is the essence. This is what we're looking for in terms of collaboration. We're looking for that sort of connection, that sort of physical yes and, where we're going back and forth. And if we really want to connect, particularly as leaders, we want to connect with followers, we want to have that sort of collaboration. We want to have that collaboration between leaders and followers. As leaders, we also want to promote that collaboration between followers and other followers. And as a leader, we want to promote that collaboration between ourselves and those who lead us. So how do we do that? Well, the obvious answer here was to say yes. But it's not as simple as that. There's stuff that gets in the way of collaboration. And you may have noticed that it wasn't just, certainly had the negative conversation when we just disagreed got in the way of collaboration. But there's something else that gets in the way of collaboration. And this is one of the great lessons from the world of theater. One of the things actors have learned, and this comes in particular from the work of a guy named Keith Johnstone in England, and that is, if you really want to create an ensemble, you want to work together, and you want to be able to collaborate, you have to stop playing status games. That the thing that gets in the way of collaboration more than anything else is status differences. And when I say status, I want to be clear about what I mean by status. I mean, I think as Japanese, you certainly know what status is. I think it's a big part of, it's a part of language, it's a part of culture, it's part of society here. But it means in theater, well, let me say, in the world of organizational studies, status is something you have. And I think a lot in culture, status is something you have. Like, I have high status because I'm a professor, or I have higher status because I'm older, or I have higher status because I'm the chairman of the company, or I have higher status because I'm male. I have low status for whatever reasons I have. So in most of the organizational world, when we think of status as something you have. In the theater world, we think of status differently. We think of status as something you do. So status is something I physically actually do. I can do like high status. I can behave in a way that is high status, or I can behave in a way that is lower status. And there really are 4 things I can do in regards to status. I can behave in a way that lowers my own status, or a way that raises my own status, and I can behave in a way that lowers someone else's status or raises their status. And it's really as simple as that. And I do this all the time. We're physically engaged in status behaviors regularly. It's the sociologist in me says it's the microdynamics of power. It's how we actually enact power on a moment-by-moment basis. There's some ways that status is enacted that is pretty universal. And we're gonna try out a couple of those. So first, I'd like you guys on stage, simply do this. Simply bring your toes in. Just bring your toes in and let the rest of your body follow. See what happens. As you can see as they do that, their toes come in, their shoulders slump a little. You can feel the weight kind of goes down into your chest. There's and how does that feel? This is a very low status position. And you feel like you don't have much power in the world. And then if you do the opposite, where you get your feet back to a normal position and take up a lot of space. Feel that, let your arms go out, let your chest expand. This is a high status position. And this is, and let's let them, we're going to do this. Why don't we come back to normal, and we're going to draw a dividing line. I'd like this half of the group to be low status. So go ahead and do the toes in, and this half be high status. Okay? And I'd like you to just kind of walk around and interact. And watch how they interact. Watch how the high status and low status people interact. So go around and mill about the stage. Walk around the stage and interact. Go ahead. And interact with each other. Come on, you high status people. Own the stage. Take control of it. See, the low status people don't even want to move. They're like, oh, the high status people out there, they just take the space. And they don't have to even say anything. We know who's high status and who's low status simply by looking at how their posture, by how they're physically acting. Okay, great. We'll come back. And let me tell you about some interesting research in this area that a psychologist named Amy Cuddy at Harvard University did this really interesting experiment where they had a group of people, and the first set they take a swab and swab the inside of their cheek so they could measure the cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So they would measure it before, and then half the group, they came and they told them to sit down. And they had them sit down in this low status pose. So they're sitting kind of with their legs crossed like this, all bound to like, ugh. And they sat there for 5 minutes and then went off to go have an interview. And they measured their cortisol again. The other half of the group, they measured the cortisol. Then they had them sit in this very high status position, all spread out, taking up lots of space. And then they measured the cortisol. And after simply sitting for 5 minutes in a high status or a low status position, there was a significant difference in the amount of cortisol, the amount of stress hormone in their bodies. The people who had been sitting in a low status position were more stressed. They had more stress hormone flowing through their bodies than the people who were sitting in the high status position. So this is one of the things we think about in terms of status and the physical bit, is that it's a process that works both ways. By physically enacting a low status, it stresses our bodies and we become low status in some ways. And by physically choosing to enact a higher status, we can become a higher status. Of course, body position, these were kind of extremes, the low status and the high status. Body position is only one way we do status. There are countless small ways we physically behave to do status. Another one is eye contact. And I'll tell you about the experiment first, and then we'll do a little eye contact. That in this experiment, they set up a computer screen, and on the computer screen was a face, just a static picture of a human face. And the people in the experiment were told to count the number of red dots that appeared on the screen. Half the group, all the red dots appeared up near the eyes of the person, of the picture on the computer screen. So essentially what it forced them to do, as they were counting red dots, it forced them to maintain eye contact with the image on the screen, which again was just a picture of a person. It didn't move or anything. It was a static image. The other half, the red dots would first appear at the person's eyes, and then it would appear down at the shoulder level, and then at the eyes, and then down at the shoulder level. So it forced the person who was counting dots to continually make eye contact and break it. Make eye contact, look away. Make eye contact, look away. As you might imagine, here again, when they assessed power, their sense of their own personal power, there was again a statistical difference, a significant difference, that the people who had maintained eye contact for a whole 5 minutes of counting red dots felt more powerful than those who had been forced to break eye contact because the dots kept moving down to the shoulder. Because in general, keeping eye contact is this very high status, powerful thing, where making eye contact and breaking it is low status. Particularly if you make eye contact, break it, and then make eye contact again and then break it again. And this is the subtlety of how status is enacted. If I make eye contact and break it and I never look back at you, that can be a fairly high status move. It's the making it, breaking it, and keeping it looking back that is the real low status move. So we'll try this experiment again. And again, this half over here, I want you guys, as we interact, to make it's right here, half, yep. I want this half, you'll be the high status half this time. So I want you to make eye contact. So when you interact with people, particularly the other group, I want you to make eye contact and keep eye contact. I want you to act like you really love eye contact. Nothing is better than eye contact. So you make it and keep it. This half, I want you to make eye contact. You really love it, but you can't keep it. So you make it, look away. Make eye contact, look away. Make it, break away. Okay? This would be the low status move. So you guys are going to make it and break away in this half, and you're going to keep eye contact. Okay, so go ahead and interact. And you can walk around and you know, mill about the stage and just watch how they interact. Okay, great. Let's come back. And what did we notice about this? I noticed that a lot of the group, the people who couldn't make eye contact, you notice their body also kind of, as they were creeped in a little, they started going that low status position. I didn't tell them to do that, but they started to adopt it. And the people who were making eye contact were big. They adopted that so that one gesture extended over to the rest of their body. And I'm going to guess that it felt very different. The people who made eye contact felt powerful and strong, and the people who were breaking eye contact started to feel weak, like they didn't quite belong. They were lower in status. And the moral of the story here is that you can do this. You can consciously choose how to embody status. You can consciously choose whether to be high status or low status. You can consciously choose when to be higher status and when to be lower status. And I'm guessing you do that to some degree anyway. But you do it based on the sort of the social rituals, the social norms, who you're interacting with. But there's some real lessons about status. And we're going to play a kind of longer status game here in a moment. But let me, the real lessons about status are that, as I said, differences in status prevent this connection and prevent collaboration. So if I really want to connect with somebody, and so I can collaborate with them, so I can have that yes and thing happening, I have to be at the same status. I have to set my status more or less equal to theirs. And this is hard. This is the fundamental issue for leaders. Because if I'm a leader in an organization, what happens to my status? Well, the rest of the people in the organization give me status. As I said, there's those 4 things you can do with status. Other people in the organization will behave in such a way as to raise my status and lower their own status in comparison. So as a leader, I'm faced with this status difference. People are inflicting a status difference on me. And yet, if I really want to connect with them and collaborate with people, I need to reduce that status difference. But at the same time, if I lower my status to the point where I try to lower it to where my status is less than theirs or equal to it, I will be seen as being unleaderly. They'll say that isn't the sort of behavior we expect from leaders. I call this the status trap. It's a thing that makes it really difficult for leaders to collaborate with the people that they're working with their followers. And there's some answers for the status trap that we'll get to near the end. But I'll tell you, one of the answers is that as a leader, I need to become a master of status. And when I think of the great leaders in the United States that we've had, and we haven't had a whole lot of them, but we've had a few. The great leaders, I think of like Bill Clinton when he was president. President Clinton was very good at changing his status. He was very good at, when he needed to be up there speaking and be high status, he could do that. But if he wanted to talk to someone individually, he could come right down and suddenly there was no status difference at all. He could connect with them. It was part of his whole I feel your pain sort of thing. So he was a real master at enacting the appropriate status for the level. And we see this, certainly in American politics, we see leaders trying to lower their status so they can connect with followers. And we'll see they'll go into a diner and have coffee and donuts with your average person as an effort to try to look like they're the same status level. And a lot of leaders aren't very good at that because they're not at that status level. And the rest of the people, everybody knows that it's kind of a fake status game. But it's all part of this status trap and how we might overcome it. So like I said, we'll get to another method for overcoming it at the end. But next thing we're going to do is actually play a little status game. And I'm going to explain the rules, and then we're going to, while they play this game, we're going to listen to, Leslie's going to share some words with us. So just so you know, here's the opening rules of this game. I'm going to give each one of the participants here on stage a playing card, ace through king. They are going to look at that card and then put it in their pocket, and that's going to be their status for the game. So if you get a 3, they're fairly low status. They get an ace, they're really low status. If you get a king or queen or jack, you're really high status. And they're going to play that status. They're going to interact with each other for about 10, 15 minutes, during which time, and they can, you might imagine that you're at a cocktail party, just having casual conversation, but you're enacting that status. You're not allowed to tell anybody what your status is. You're not allowed to ask anybody what their status is. You have to enact that status. And at the end of the game, I'm going to ask you to line up based upon status. Highest status at one end, lowest status at the other end. Because your job during this game is to discover whether your status is higher or lower than everyone else in the group. So you need to interact with everybody else long enough and thoroughly enough to know whether they are a higher or lower status than you. Or possibly, since there's 14 of you, they might be the exact same status. That'll probably happen a couple times. Okay, so you guys know the rules. I will hand out cards, and can we bring Leslie in now? Hi, Leslie. Are you hearing her? Okay, we'll sure. I'm going to hand this over.
Hello.
So, Leslie, hello. I think everyone in the floor can listen to you. So, could you please start your presentation? Your video is on screen.
I can see my video, but you can hear me. Is that correct? You can hear me? Okay. First of all, Ohayo, konnichiwa, yokoso, go shotai arigato gozaimasu. Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you for attending our session and being patient with any of the technical problems that we've had. If we haven't encountered any, then we're doing something right. First of all, I want to thank Associate Professor Steve Taylor for suggesting my collaboration on this conference session. And I'd also very much like to thank Associate Professor Takaya Karamura for inviting me to participate in this session as well. I'm very honored. So thank you very much for your patience and for having me here. I recently published an article that discussed the skills that are necessary for organization development consultants, especially in these current economic times. And some of those skills are demanded by how the discipline of OD, organization development, is morphing from a traditional model of, again, simple collaboration, as Steve has been showing here, to what's called more of a meaning creating co-creation of knowledge by which to manage change. So first of all, we have collaboration, and through collaboration, we are co-creating a meaning, just like you're watching on stage. And this is called in the literature a more dialogic interpretation. Now, we engage more with the client in that way that co-creates meaning in the organization, especially today. And I'm experiencing this in my work at the Cleveland Clinic. Now, the basic skills that are demanded by OD consultants today are, frankly, they're not much different than they were in the beginning, frankly. I suggest that because of our technology, and I'm very grateful for it today, because I'm able to join you, but because of our technology today, we're not as able to have as rich a conversation as we might be able to have, like the participants are having on stage here right now. It's a very rich, very immediate interaction that they're having. And again, they are co-creating the meaning. Now, these basic skills allow us to interact authentically. And this is a word that Dr. Taylor frequently uses in his writing, is being real, being honest, being present with your scene partner. And I find it interesting that one of the founders of the OD discipline, Richard Beckhard, began his working career as a stage manager on Broadway. And I like to think, even though this can't be proven, that perhaps the beginnings of organization development as a discipline sort of sprung out of the roots from Richard Beckhard's experience in the theater and the training that he had from the theater. So even though I worked for NASA, these skills, trust me, are not rocket science. So what are these skills that actually you're watching being enacted right now on stage? What are those skills that OD consultants learn, that actors learn? Very simply, they learn to listen, observe, collaborate, and be self-aware. 4 skills. Very easy, very simple, not rocket science, but much, much harder to enact. So the thing about these 4 skills is that they are teachable. As you can see, we've gone through several exercises right now. I've done 7 years of training and working just on those skills: listening, observing, collaborating, and being self-aware. So I'm going to take each one by one. So first I'll take observation. And I'm starting with this skill because I think actors come by it somewhat naturally. We're constantly observing how people walk, how they talk, how they use their hands, all sorts of little behavioral mannerisms we as actors are always watching and kind of cataloging in the back of our minds so that we can use it at a later point. Now, in one of these times happened for me is I was watching a woman in my neighborhood walk down the street, and she walked from side to side to move herself forward instead of, the formal walking, as you would walk forward normally. She moved from side to side like this to move forward. Well, I was behind her, and I was trying to imitate her walk. And I thought, if I put this on stage, no one would believe me. Sometimes the things that you see in real life are just too hard to believe if you put them on stage. You'd say, oh, nobody walks like that. Nobody walks side to side like that. But here's an instance where in real life it did happen. So the next skill is that I want to talk about is the ability to be self-aware. Now, I need to know my own issues, biases, perspectives, reactions, actions, strengths, weaknesses, fears, abilities, skills. Actually, we as researchers are also very, very familiar, hopefully very familiar with our biases as well. We have to be familiar with whatever is going to confound our research. We have to know that so that we can extract our own biases and hopefully be as objective or as observant as possible. So a good actor learns how to take an inventory of themselves, and we continue this inventory throughout our lives because we know, of course, as we grow older, we change, we have different perspectives from our life experiences. So we're constantly changing our perspective and continually have to be self-aware. And we're always seeking to be authentic, to be real. That's the goal. So the next skill, the third skill is listening. Now, you might not think that listening is a skill. Some of you may have had some training in active listening, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, listening. I was playing a role in a play, Antigone. I was playing Antigone in Ennuy's version of Antigone. And at one point I had to listen to the main character. And so I kind of cocked my head and listened like this. And then my acting teacher said, don't indicate that you're listening, just listen. So how authentically does one just listen? Well, you can see it being enacted right here in front of you. Again, they're just listening. They're not thinking about listening. They're just listening. So, what's interesting about this for an actor is that the audience is also listening, but they're also communicating. And the actor is listening to the audience as well as listening to the other actor. Now, this, of course, it's in many forms of theater. Theater has an audience. Is theater without an audience? I don't know, but theater has an audience. And we are all co-creating the meaning. Each actor and the audience, we're all co-creating the meaning. And I like to think that actors think on three different levels. We think on the superficial level of, I'm just going to remember my lines and not bump into the furniture. And then the second level that an actor thinks on is, well, I am this character and I'm performing this play and I'm going to be real and authentic, and they're thinking about playing the character. And then the deepest level of concentration for the actor is when we are actually just being that person in that environment, and we're not thinking about bumping into the furniture, and we're not thinking about that I'm an actor, but we're actually invested in being that person that we are embodying. We are embodying that person. And that's the deepest level of concentration. But then also simultaneously, as I said, actors are talking to each other, and then we're also listening to the audience. And depending on what the audience is, how the audience is reacting to us, each of us as actors are adjusting our performances to co-create the meaning with you as the audience, as I am doing right now. I can now see you, and I see you listening to me, and that is giving me a different signal of a way to speak with you, of a way to talk with you, of a way to connect with you, so that we're co-creating the meaning of this particular session. So these things are all teachable, as you can see from Dr. Taylor's various exercises. And we do these all the time, and warm-ups, and we continually do exercises. So this leads us to the final skill of collaboration. And it's interesting that most of the session that Dr. Taylor has been talking about has been about collaboration. All of these skills are about collaboration. Ego cannot be involved in this type of work. We're all here to commit to communicating the message of the playwright. That's what our main goal is, and each one of us has a particular role to play to communicate a specific message that the author, that the playwright has written for us. And even though they're small parts, they're still very, very important parts. They are each a part of the entire whole, and each has a key to play, a key role to play. Now, if we apply these simple skills, somewhat simple skills, to our work with and as managers and leaders, again, we have the ability to co-create meaningful work. As we observe our clients and their behaviors, we can begin to understand their point of view. We can be empathic. We can say yes and go forward with a positive attitude that then builds and creates. We don't think about creating, but it happens. We co-create our meaning. We listen without judgment, and of course we can never be totally objective, but this is where the skill of being self-reflective comes in, and where then I'm aware of my biases. So you can start to see how these skills kind of build on each other. First of all, listening, and then being observant, and being self-aware, and then collaborating. And as I said, these skills are not rocket science. We all think that we apply these skills in our lives. We do that, but actors are taught that. We're taught to heighten these skills so that we're able to use them at a moment's notice. So I see Dr. Taylor is waiting for me to conclude, and I again want to thank you so much for having me. And Steve, take it away. Thank you very much.
Sorry, 7. We were doing very good there. We're ace, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 7, 10, Jack, 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 Queen, Queen, King. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. And they did this without ever telling each other what their status was, simply by how they interacted with each other. You know, and some of it was actually it was really easy watching. I think any of us was watching, I knew you were an ace right away. You know, we knew, we got that. You know, and we got king right away. It's interesting that even within like the group of jacks, you guys had a relative order of jackness, of who was the higher jack, who was the lower jack, that, you know, and the queens, but we knew king right away. And it's always really easy to tell at the tops and the bottoms. We didn't have, you noticed when they were first lining up here, there was kind of some gaps here. And you guys couldn't figure it out because you're like, you were lining up and there were these big gaps showing up. Well, it's because there was a big gap in status, right? You know, from 3 to, you were 3, right? 3 to 7, and 7 to 10, there were big gaps here. So we're going to, this is one thing, this is all about how you do status. So this exercise was about how everybody enacted status, how they raised their status and lowered their status. And from watching that, we were able to figure it out. But as I said, there is the other half of this. We're going to do the other version of the exercise next, which is about how people do status to you. And this is the part leaders really have to worry about, is how do other people raise my status or lower my status? So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to give them cards, but I'm going to ask them to hold the card up on their forehead and do the same exercise where they actually have to talk to each other and figure out what their status is so they can line up again. But this time, they won't know their own status. Everyone else will know their status because everyone will be able to see the card on their forehead. So it's the same exercise. Again, you can't ask about status or tell anybody your status, but you must enact whatever status they have. And then you need to figure it out what status you are based upon how other people are acting towards you. And so while they do this, we're going to watch a couple videos on screen. We'll start the videos and then I'll give them their cards. And what you're about to see are 3 videos from places where, from well-known business schools, where they're using the arts in leadership development and in management work. And the 3 you're going to see are, the first one I think is Stefan. You'll see a Stefan Meisik, the Associate Professor Stefan Meisik from the Copenhagen Business School. He'll talk a bit about their studio work there. And then you'll see Associate Professor Klaus-Peter Schultz from ICN in Nancy, France. And finally, from here in Tokyo, Professor Kotaro Takagi, I'm going to be horrible pronouncing this, from Ayami Gakuin University, Graduate School of Social Informatics. So again, 3 videos about, and more broadly, about the use of arts in business programming, and we'll watch those. And I'm going to give you guys cards, and we'll do this again.
Design-Driven Innovation Strategy course, which basically brings together students with people from the Danish design contexts, companies, associations, projects. And the idea is basically to have the students understand how there are cultural and technological sources of newness and novelty, and how basically to use design-driven design drivenness, basically to make that a core competence of the company, to bring it into the strategy and to develop processes around it for doing so. This course takes place in the studio for the simple reason that it is not a purely lecture-based course. We have the visitors. The visitors usually bring challenges from their companies. So today we have a challenge from Mikael Halstrup, who is the Chief Visionary Officer at DesignNet, and he basically asked the students to come up with new areas where design-driven innovation can make a difference.
They kind of they knew they would come after them, right? And she did like this, with this phone, and said, "Hey, you can just take it." What? Yeah, just take it. We thought it was an iPhone, and it was a Lumia, and that kind of, I think.
The house itself, the studio in which we are, supports this by actually providing an informal, loose, flexible environment which the students can actually adapt to their working needs and comfort.
Konnichiwa. May I first introduce myself? My name is Klaus-Peter Schulz. I come from ICM Business School in Nancy, Metz in France. And I work there in the field of strategy and entrepreneurship. So the place where I come from is in the center of Europe. There you see pictures of the beautiful city of Metz on one side and of Nancy on the other side. What I would like to talk to you about today is how we could use methods, modeling methods like Lego, to simply develop ideas and share understandings. Very often in our business context and in our social contexts, we have to deal with complex processes, we have to deal with various perspectives and angles, specific knowledge and goals, and if we talk together with different stakeholder groups from the public, from politics, from private institutions or public institutions, we have a lack of shared understanding. Because people come from different directions and they have different things in mind. So we need to apply simple tools where we can first develop shared understanding and secondly facilitate creative development of ideas. So the basic idea is that we apply a principle called seamless play. It's a kind of combination of non-systematic playfulness with intention, with goal. So it's a kind of intuitively playing, composing something together with having a final tool. Okay, this can easily be done with tool sets like Lego, where you can put together easily small metaphors meaning something, and you can share these metaphors with other people, so it's a way to develop shared understanding and also a shared object and to share ideas. So the basic principle of this Lego series play is that we ask question to the participants and to the audience, and those people in a playful mood, they develop something like their individual model on how they would like to answer this question. And the next step is that they tell a story about the meaning of their model. Because without the meaning, the model is more or less useless. So it's always two things: the model itself, the physical model, and the story behind. And the good thing with Lego, for example, is that everything fits. So at the end of the day, it's not just one model, but you can easily put individual models together to a shared model. And that's what we also do and did in several workshops. And you can see this here. This is an example of a workshop at Osaka City University with healthcare professionals developing shared future visions about healthcare and social care in the Osaka region. So those people were confronted with the question on how healthcare can look like, what healthcare can look like in future, and how to develop a model about this. So, and later on, these models are discussed and reflected, and questions are asked on how the models can be realized. So I hope you got a brief idea on how Lego can be used for developing a shared understanding and for idea development. Thank you very much.
皆さんこんにちは。青山学院大学大学院社会情報学研究科博士前期課程ヒューマンイノベーションコースの学部です。ヒューマンイノベーションコースは学びを学ぶ大学院のキーコンセプトとして2008年にスタートしました。各学年10名ほどの院生のうちおよそ8割が社会人で、企業、学校教育、医療、福祉、ワークショップデザインなど多様な現場から集まってきています。カリキュラムは認知科学や社会学をベースにした学習学系科目とワークショップデザインを中心とした学習デザイン系科目で構成されています。学生たちにはこの2つの系の科目をバランスよく履修することが求められます。こうしたカリキュラムを通して我々が目指すのは単に認知科学研究やワークショップデザインのスキルを提供することではありません。ワークショップという凝縮された学びのスタイルを共通のプラットフォームとして人間の学習について科学的かつ実践的な理解を深めること、これがヒューマンイノベーションコースの教育の目的です。この大学院と密接に連携して展開しているのがワークショップデザイナー育成プログラムです。これは学校教育法に基づく履修証明書が発行される社会人向けプログラムで、地域教育や学校支援の関係者、芸術家、企業の研修担当者など幅広い実践家を対象としています。プログラムの定員は50名、全120時間で構成され、これまでに十数回開催されていますが、いつも定員を大幅に上回る申し込みをいただいています。このプログラムの修了者がヒューマンイノベーションコースに進学するケースも増えてきています。プログラムの様子を記録したビデオがありますので、最後にそれをご覧ください。ありがとうございました。
くるし、こっちにも行くみたいな、なんかこういう。もう一個電話が出てきて、このそうわー出てきたやつが。
それをビジュアルに変えたときに、それは色がこう何色についても、それは見る人の自由である。
言葉、イメージ、ポエジーというのが、全部、合わさった。
途中で止まっちゃって、実は長くないものも、あったりするっていう場合はある。
Hi, Leslie. Welcome back. And we've finished our second round of the exercise here and lined up, and we're just going to go look at the results of that quickly. So starting from the low end, we have a 4, 5, 6, 6, 7, 8, 9, 8. Oh, our first one. 8, 9, 10, 9, Jack. Jack, you were king last time, yeah? The cards never lie. So what is that? So here we had a few mistakes, but where they're off by 1, an 8 or a 9 or a 9 or a 10, and that highlights one of the aspects of this status. That in the real world, most of us spend our time. We don't spend our time down at the 1, 2, 3 range or at the king, queen, jack range. We spend our time in the middle. Most of us in status situations find ourselves in the middle with people of similar status. And we spend a lot of time, and it's difficult to kind of work out the difference between 8 and 9, 9 and 10. That those can be hard things. And being on, because my idea of a 9 may be slightly different than your idea of a 9 on this. But that's the difficult range, and that's the area where we're constantly working it out. But even within that range, you may have noticed that look how well overall they did. In both exercises. In the first one, they were dead on. In this one, off by a little, but not much. And what it shows is how good we are at reading status. How good we are at understanding status. In the first case where we could enact a particular status and everybody else would get it. Everybody else understood what status I was, lower or higher. In this one, we didn't know our own status, but very quickly, as I was watching this very quickly, the people in the high status, with the high status cards, other people started treating them well. People were like, oh, people were bowing to them. And this whole, oh, you're a jack, you must be very important. And they got it. And they started enacting it. Very quickly, the people at the high status, as other people treat them well, you could see the body posture. Very quickly, it was, well, I don't know what I am, but it's pretty darn good. It's something fantastic here. So both sides, it's the essence of, I'd say, the sort of the social construction of status. That is, I get to have the status I think I have and put it out there in the world, but the world is also inflicting status on me. Others are also deciding what status I have. And so both sides of that interaction are constantly happening.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Leslie.
You had some doubles and triples there, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
I always like to ask those doubles and triples why one took more status than the other.
Yes, it's a good question. Let's ask, where were there were some tens, or right, there were the same multiple tens or multiple nines. We had a 9 and 9 and 9. And so why were you up here? Why were you a much better 9 than she was?
他の人の対応からもう少し上かなと思ってたんですけども、多分直接あんまりここ話してなかったっていうのも大きいのかなと思います。
We didn't talk each other, so I suppose he did not think he's higher than he is in the same status with me, maybe.
Okay, so this brings really another important point about status. We don't do status just for the other person. If I raise somebody's status, it's not just for their purpose, for their benefit. It's for the audience. the vast majority of status interactions are about demonstrating status for those who are watching. It is for the audience. It is not just for the other. They are done when there is an audience presence of other people, and they all watch it and get it. We see this, I think, in healthcare. There's a lot of issues around bullying, particularly in the United States, at least, in the West, around issues of bullying amongst nurses. And bullying is really just a status interaction. It says, I have more power than you, so I can treat you this way. I can treat you poorly. And it's done not just for the sake of the person who's being bullied, but for the sake of the audience. So everybody knows I have power. It demonstrates what the status hierarchy is. It's all about the audiencing portion of it. It's tremendously important. I have one more exercise I want to do, and then we'll have some closing comments. And I said right before we started these that I was going to offer you a way out of status. And here it is. Here's the big secret, the thing you've come for. And it's really simple. If you want to get past status interactions and be able to connect with people and reach that sort of collaborative point, that yes and connection, 2 + 2 = 5, wonderful sort of energy, if you want to get there, the way you do it is you open your heart. And it's really that simple. You open your heart to the other person and talk honestly about who you are and what your issues are. And when you open your heart, if you can manage to open your heart, opening your heart involves a tremendous amount of vulnerability. If you can manage to open your heart, suddenly the status falls away and real collaboration becomes possible. And this is true for leaders, that it's even if the other people in the room are giving you enormous status, if you can open your heart to them, that status difference starts to fall away, and we can actually connect and collaborate. So we're going to do one more exercise, and I want you to do it in the same pairs we did in the first part when we first did the exercise that had the negative, where we were disagreeing with each other, then we were agreeing, and then we were saying yes and. I want you guys, if you could be in the same pairs. And this exercise is very simply, I'm going to give you a few minutes to talk to each other. I'll give you about 5 minutes to talk to each other because it can take a little while. And all I want you to do is open your heart to the other person and talk to them about what you find most difficult as a leader. What is the hardest part of being a leader for you? So just open your heart and share with the other person what is the most difficult thing about leadership for you. And I'll give you about 5 minutes to have this conversation. And as you do it, pay attention to the sense of connection and how the status feels. Okay? So 5 minutes on opening your heart about what you find most difficult as a leader. Okay, so if you could bring those conversations to a close. And if we could bring Leslie back. Hi, Leslie. And I just want to say that this is to me the great lesson that you learn as an actor. It's the great lesson of theater training. It's not an easy lesson, but it's a lesson that if I want to collaborate, I have to learn how to get past status games and not spend my energy playing status, trying to be more important than the other person, or less important, depending upon what my own personal proclivities are. I have to open my heart and be vulnerable to my fellow actors on stage and to the audience. And there is incredible power in this ability to be open, to stand tall and be able to say, here I am, this is me. This is the raw, real me. I'm not being protected. I'm not putting up lots of barriers and shields and pretenses. I'm being open. What you see is what you get. And whether we call it being real or being authentic or opening your heart to others, it's a fundamental act that actors spend a lot of time working on. And for me, is also a fundamental act of leadership. But if leaders want to lead in the way that Amanda Sinclair talked about, and I mentioned at the start, if leaders want to say leadership is about liberating others, the place to start is by liberating yourself and learning to open your own heart to others. Because then you can be a model for others, and you can establish that real connection and that real collaboration that can lead to real, I think, real leadership and real growth of ourselves. And for me, that's one of the biggest lessons that we have to learn, that leadership and business has to learn from the arts and from theater. That's kind of my closing comment. I'll turn it over to Leslie for some final words.
My reaction to what you have to say, Steve, is that by opening yourself, opening your heart, and being vulnerable, you actually draw people to you, as opposed to pretending or indicating or acting as if you have power or status. By simply opening yourself up to another person, you don't have to work at it. You just naturally draw people to you.
Yeah, I think so. It's a really kind of paradoxical and fantastic thing that can happen.
Yeah.
And I would invite you to work on it, to practice it. You had 5 minutes here where I asked you to open your heart to others. What that felt like, it was probably not the simplest thing in the world. It may not have come naturally. Most of us have learned, particularly in the business world, to be fairly guarded and protected. But it's one of those things that when you consciously work on it, you can pay attention. You can pay attention to status games that occur in your organization. You can pay attention to how status is enacted, not just through the formal hierarchy of I know this person is important because they have this title, so I will treat them this way. But even through the more microdynamics, the individual things, the people who are, how status is enacted, people at your same level. And when people enact status on you, many of you are leaders in your organizations, how do you deal with that? How do you connect with them? How do you get past that status? How do you get past that status difference and really connect? It's an opportunity to open yourself up and let them be drawn to you, as Leslie would say.
Steve, we're trying to do just that at where I work now at Cleveland Clinic. The leaders are working on making this part of our culture, actually, of serving each other and collaborating and opening ourselves up to be empathic so that we can better serve the patient, which is always our first and foremost goal. So what we've done here in the workshop today is actually being enacted, at least in my organization.
That's great. And the Cleveland Clinic is a real world leader You know, I've had some experiences. My father spent 4 months at the Cleveland Clinic near the end of his life, and it was a really wonderful place. So, should I turn over to Kai? Did you have any final words you wanted to say to close the session? Or please? Well, in that case, I would just like to first thank all of you on stage for being willing to come out here and share, not really knowing what you're getting into, but to come out and act and perform, to not only engage in workshop, but to engage in performance of workshop. It's very brave, very wonderful, and I certainly appreciate it. And Leslie, I'd like to thank you for being willing to stay up late in Cleveland and join us virtually. It was
My
really
pleasure.
great, an excellent contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank, you know, the Secretariat and the Congress for inviting me to come over and do this. I've really enjoyed it, and it's a real honor. It's a real honor to come here and do this, and I feel deeply touched and moved. And I thank you for being a great audience. It's been really wonderful. So I think the next thing is lunch. So let's have lunch. Wait, we still... You have 10 minutes? Oh, so we have 10, I'm sorry. We still have 10 minutes, I'm told. So we can have questions or comments from people on stage or from the audience. We need to use the microphone so it gets translated. Oh, and we have somebody with a microphone running up. Fantastic.
これは聞いた話なんですが、嘘をつくときに男は目をそらす。でも女の人はむしろ逆に相手の目をじっと見るという話を聞いたことがあります。でもアクターの場合、目をそらすということが、観客には男性が多いので、女性はそれは嘘だと知りつつ、嘘であるということを表現するのに目をそらすというようなことを聞いたことがあるんですけれども、そういう男女の性差というものが、そういうアクティングに影響はしないんでしょうか。
Yes, the question, as I understand, is about sort of gender differences, and I'm not familiar with the work on the eye contact and lying portion, but there are clearly gender differences in how status is played out. And let me tell a brief story. I have a friend and colleague in England, Piers Ibbotson, who he was a director at the Royal Shakespeare Company for many years, and he does, and most of these status exercises I learned from him. And Piers does this same exercise, the first one we did with the cards. He did it once for a group of women managers, an all-female group at a bank. And when he did it, Piers told me, he said, whenever I give out the cards and I watch people interact, I can always watch, I know what the statuses are. He's really, really good at reading status from his years as a theater director. And he can always read it, and he can always tell when they've got it and who's which status and what the relative status is. But when he did it with a group that was completely female, he said after about 15 minutes of watching, he had no idea. He completely had no idea what the relative status was. So he asked the women to line up, and they got it perfectly right. The women all knew what the status was, but Piers, as a man, could not read the status moves that were happening in an all-female group. And the moral of the story is that in mixed companies, the women tend to enact status in ways that are more male or men understand. But left to their own devices, when they're on, the women enact status differently, because the women tend to be able to read male status, but males don't tend to be, particularly Piers as a theater expert, couldn't read the status in an all-female group. And it's because I think there are very fundamentally different ways that women enact status than men do. I mean, it's true when we go to the the extreme case of status to me is organizational bullying. And the sort of bullying and behavior, even at age 4 or 5, little boys and little girls enact status and hierarchy differently. Boys fairly quickly figure out what the status is, and if they want to bully another, they want to show I'm higher in status, they'll just hit him, knock him over, said, okay, we got it. It becomes very physical, it's very explicit. Girls, on the other hand, do very different behaviors. They do eye rolling or gossiping and forming cliques, and it's very dynamic. It's constantly changing, and it's very subtle kind of behaviors. So there are ways which there actually are, I think, there are tremendous gender differences. There are some cultural differences too, but there are definitely gender differences in how status gets enacted. And the bad news is for most men is we don't have a clue about how women do status. Where we tend to be really bad at reading status in women.
We like it that way.
and Leslie likes it that way. Are there more questions from the audience, or?
すいません。日本の会社だけかも分かりませんが、その、管理者なら管理者、その、個人というよりもそれのその後ろに誰がいるか、会長かもしれません、あるいは、名誉会長かもしれません、そういうそのパーソナルな関係というよりもむしろその会社全体の組織のパワーバランスっていうのがその、課長なら課長の後ろにある、そういう状況っていうのは、クリオダンクリニックの場合はですね、どうでありますか。私もよく、クリーブランドには行っていたのでよく状況は少しは分かっているんですが、よろしくお願いします。
We're working with an initiative right now. It's an integrative initiative where we're having to respond to, the healthcare reform. And this is going to take some repositioning of our costs, of course, because of the Affordable Health Care Act. So what we are working on right now is making sure that what we call the voice of the client is heard. We have representatives from every stakeholder constituency as we do this work, and it's very difficult to make sure that everyone feels as if they are, not as if, but feels that they are included and that their voice is being heard. And we constantly have to say, what's the voice of the client? What are they saying? Are they included? So that's how we're working with power, actually. We know that the CEO has the authority to make decisions, but he doesn't make them alone. He consults with the various other constituents and the physicians who lead the organization, because it's a very different structure in that way, that this particular hospital is physician-led. So the physicians drive it, but in dialogue with all the other people who are involved with the change effort or with the initiative that we're currently enacting. So that's how we deal with status, basically. We know that these people have power. They have the authority to make certain decisions. But if somebody feels left out, those people are going to have their voice and they're going to be heard. And they make sure of it. So does that answer your question?
And if I could let me just add a little to that. I think the idea that, our particular power and status may come not just from our position, but from who we're connected to is typical everywhere. That, that it's power and status, the sources of it are very complex. And yet, at the same time, it becomes enacted in that physical interaction. Mm. So we may watch that interaction and say, wow, that person seems to have way more status than would be appropriate for just their position. There's probably a reason why. And it could be because they're connected to the chairman or someone else or an outside client or who knows what. But whatever it is, and this is part of the difference is why when we think of status, we're interested in the physical enactment of the status as you interact with people, which is not simply sort of the official status you would get from hierarchy or the official status that would be displayed in language even. It's the status that gets embodied in the interactions with people. And it does, and eventually this is where it happens. For all those various reasons we may have it, but it happens in those physical interactions. So the guy is telling me time is up. Thank you very much for those questions. Very helpful. And again, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
どうもありがとうございました。これでセッション1を終えたいと思いますが、その前に前の14名の参加者と、それからクリーブランドから深夜遅くにもかかわらず参加していただいたレズリー・ステイガー先生に再度拍手をお願いいたします。Thank you, Leslie. We enjoyed it.